All right, picking up where we left off last time, we just talked about Herod the Great reigning as the king of the Jews. Meanwhile, Pompey was exerting power in the east, and he had a bitter rival that you'll recognize by name, Julius Caesar. He was busy in the west, and from 58 BC to 51 BC, he conquered Gaul, and he went down in history for his campaigns. Latin students still read about the campaigns of Julius Caesar. Now, the Roman Senate was under pressure from Pompey, and they removed Caesar from his army command, but he didn't care. He marched his armies across the Rubicon. That's the river that served as the boundary between his province and Italy. Within 60 days, he was in command of all of Italy. Showdown battle fought between Caesar and Pompey in east central Greece, and Pompey was defeated in 48 BC. He fled to Egypt. Didn't take long for him to be murdered there. Meanwhile, Caesar sailed for Egypt in pursuit of Pompey, and after a narrow escape there of his own, he got assistance from an army from Syria, in which, watch this now, Antipater, the father of Herod the Great, played a very important part. Antipater had acted as the power behind Hyrcanus II, and remember, that's who Pompey had appointed as high priest over Judea. But with the Caesar's rise to political power, Antipater was developing new loyalties, and he was being rewarded for his loyalty. And I know you've heard of Cleopatra. She's not a make-believe character. She was real. She was Caesar's choice for the throne of Egypt. And she was an heiress to the dynasty of the Ptolemies, so she had a bloodline claim to some of that office. But they thought she'd be subservient to Rome. But after the death of Caesar, Cleopatra became involved in a power struggle between Octavian and Antony. And then at a famous battle called the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, the forces of Antony and Cleopatra were crushed, and Egypt became a Roman province. And watch this, Octavian emerged as the first Roman emperor, known as Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar. Now, this map in your textbook shows you some of the different invasions that led to the rise of Rome. Before the death of Augustus in AD 14, the empire had already greatly increased. Your book shows you a map that shows just how much it had increased. By this time, Spain's completely occupied, and you've got Asia Minor taken over. Augustus had even the upper Euphrates, the edge of the Arabian desert. Now, some of the successors of Augustus you will also perhaps recognize. They continued this policy of taking more and more land. Tiberius reigned from AD 14 to AD 37. He annexed Cappadocia up in Asia Minor. Remember, Asia Minor's modern-day Turkey. Caligula, from AD 37 to 41, added modern-day Morocco to his list of lands. And then under Claudius, AD 41 to 54, Thrace and Lycia were occupied by Rome, and the empire kept on extending northward, even to include Britain. Now, during the reigns of the Flavian empires, as they're sometimes called, AD 69 to 96, Roman civilization reached into southern Germany, claimed the territory southeast of the Black Sea. But the empire, watch this part right here, the empire reached its maximum extent under Trajan, AD 98 to 117 AD. So when did the empire reach its maximum extent? Under Trajan. Now, the Roman Empire would not last forever. Gaul and Britain were separated from the power during a portion of the 3rd century. Egypt and Syria were ruled from Palmyra, which was northeast of Damascus. And Rome's prestige was shrinking greatly. Watch this here, you'll need to know it. The empire lasted until AD 476. AD 476. And it fell before invaders. What goes around comes around, and Rome had brought many people to their knees, and now Rome was going to be coming to her knees. Now, after Rome, you have what's called the Byzantine Empire, and it continued all the way up until the fall of Constantinople in AD 1453. And by the way, Constantinople is modern-day Istanbul, and so keep that in mind. Now, please zoom in on this right here. The Latin language is one of the so-called Romance languages, and that would include languages like Italian and French and Spanish. That was a huge part of Rome's contributions to the world in which Christ came. Roman law, with its modern system of jurisprudence, is indeed modern, because even though it was ancient at the time they invented it, it's become adopted by most modern Western societies. And then on the material side of things, the Roman roads were really huge in encouraging the spread and acceleration of travel, which led to the ease of spreading the gospel. It became a lot easier. Now, the unity of the empire was again against Christianity, but it actually, by God's providence, Christianity was able to spread rapidly, even in a time when it was greatly opposed. Now, as we move on into chapter 20, this is a discussion of New Testament Palestine. New Testament Palestine. One thing that's very interesting, the Romans, for all of their military power and exploits, were never successful in completely dominating and ruling Palestine. In fact, there's some historical documents that even refer to this as their Palestine problem. Now let's talk about the provinces that they controlled in the land of Palestine, and we'll be looking at some maps in the Access Foundation Bible Atlas. Of course, the Jordan River's always been like a natural dividing line for part of Palestine versus the part across the Jordan. And so we'll notice, first of all, west of the Jordan, starting from the south and moving up to the north, you've got three provinces. You've got Judea, you've got Samaria, and then you have Galilee. Now let's look at this on the map. Zoom out a little bit here and show you New Testament Palestine. You'll notice here's Judea, here's Samaria, and here's Galilee. As we go back a little bit, you'll notice here in this particular map, map 100, this talks about the kingdom of Herod the Great. And again, you see some of the divisions here: Judea, Samaria, Galilee, in that order, from south to north. Now let's look at these individually for just a moment. Remember that the tribes of Judah and Dan and Benjamin and Simeon really all comprised Judah or Judea, and it was the largest of the Palestinian provinces. Now, if you look south of Hebron, the area then was known as Idumea. Now, I know we called it Edom in times past. Actually, Edom was more over in this area, but the Nabateans pushed the Edomites up, and they actually had to form a new identity as the Idumeans. Your textbook notices that, of course, we have the Philistine plain of the Negev. There was an Aramaic word for that, Daroma. It meant south. Now, as far as Samaria is concerned, remember it was between Judea and the Mount Carmel range. So here is Judea right here, and then you see Mount Carmel up here, Galilee up here. Samaria is sandwiched between Judea and Galilee. One of the parts of Samaria bordering the Mediterranean was known as the Sharon, or Plain of Sharon. We sing a song sometimes, Jesus Rose of Sharon, bloom within my heart. This was viewed as a tremendously fertile location along the Mediterranean, and that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, one thing your book points out, that the plain of Sharon was actually occupied largely by Gentiles, and some of those districts in the interior of the northern kingdom were inhabited by people of mixed race. Well, how did they get mixed in their race? When Samaria fell to the Assyrians in 2 Kings 17, there was a lot of intermarriage that took place thereafter. In fact, the Assyrians had a policy of importing people in as well as deporting people. And so you see the Israelites and the Assyrians coming together and producing offspring, and they became known as the Samaritans. They were remnants of the 10 northern tribes and from the non-Israelites that were imported into Samaria after it fell. Now, after the return of the Jews from captivity, Samaritans and Jews still did not get along. They clashed. They were bitter rivals. In fact, a Samaritan temple was built on Mount Gerizim 4 centuries before Christ. It was destroyed by John Hyrcanus, the Maccabean prince, but the site of that temple still continued to be to the Samaritan, quote, a holy place. That's the way they viewed it. And the Samaritan woman, you may recall, even got in a discussion with Jesus about where the proper place for worship would be. And he focused attention on the nature of true worship and did tell her, of course, that God had the right to choose where worship would be done, and Jerusalem was the God-approved place. Many of the Jews, notice this, would choose to detour across the Jordan and travel through Perea instead of going through the land of the Samaritans when they were headed to Galilee. Let me show it to you on the map. Here they are in Judea. Let's say that someone in Judea wanted to go to Galilee. Well, the shortest distance between 2 points, of course, is a straight line. And remember, the more you get over in this direction, the more hilly and mountainous it is. This is a much flatter turf and territory. And so, do you know what these people did? they would, notice your book mentioned Perea. They would come across the Jordan into Perea and then come up and continue on into Galilee, bypassing Samaria altogether. That was their plan. Leave Judea and come over into Perea and then come on up and then cross back over. Of course, as you may have already figured out, Jesus Christ was, there's a statement made in John 4, he must needs go through Samaria. So here's Jesus in Judea. It wasn't a geographical necessity, though it was the most logical way to travel. It was a theological reason. Jesus went through Samaria because he wanted them to know of his love for all men. All right. Galilee. When Christ was walking the earth, Galilee became a homeland for him, extended southward from the highlands of Lake Semechanitis. Do you remember what that's also known as? Lake Hula. And you remember what it's like now? It's all stopped up and filled in. That's what they did to it. By the way, Tiberias, the Sea of Tiberias, is also known as the Sea of Galilee. And it was largely a Gentile city until Jerusalem fell in AD 70. Now notice that the area that was up above Mount Carmel and Gilboa, and that went westward all the way from the Jordan Valley onto Phoenicia, that became known as, quote, the Galilee of the Gentiles. And so the province there in Galilee was divided into two sections. There was Lower Galilee, that would be the territory to the south of Tiberias and Acco, or Ptolemy as it was called in New Testament times. I'll show it to you here on the map. You'll notice there's some different names for some of these places in the New Testament that we don't see in the Old Testament. I mentioned Ptolemy a moment ago. It's right here. It was also known as Acco. You'll notice there's a plain that runs along here, and that's the area that we were talking about a moment ago. Now, let me point out to you that Jews did live in Galilee during Maccabean times. Simon brought Jews from Galilee to Jerusalem. And under John Hyrcanus, Samaria was subjugated, and the borders of the Jewish kingdom extended all the way northward to Galilee. But Jerusalem Jews tended to frown on the Galileans because of their peculiar dialect. You see, we're not the only people that have a language in the north and language in the south that's different. This is not a new thing. You could even see it in Jerusalem in the south and Galilee in the north. I'm not suggesting Jerusalem spoke with a southern accent such as the one you and I might have, but it was southern for its time at least. And so the Galileans, they were very loyal to the Jewish faith and the nation. You'll need to know this point right here. 11 of the 12 disciples were Galileans, and you'll need to know the one who wasn't. And of course, as you study the ministry of our Lord, the greater part of his ministry was actually performed there in the region of Galilee. It became the center of Judaism. Even after the destruction of Jerusalem, it became the center of Judaism. Now, east of the Jordan, we looked at one of these already, Perea, and then Decapolis. Let's talk about them, and then we'll show them on the map. The area that's east of the Jordan, Transjordan, extending northward from the Arnon River to the town of Pella, was known as Perea. It's the Greek equivalent of what we say when we say Transjordan, the land beyond. Perea is about the size of the territory that Reuben and Gad had occupied as tribes of Israel. And during New Testament times, it was largely occupied by the Jews, but the Gentiles did live in a number of its villages. I'll go to the map here and we'll take a look at it. Here you see it. This shaded in area here is Perea. This is the area. Now, Decapolis was also mentioned, you'll notice. And this is the area, Deca meaning 10, polis, the Greek word for city. So 10 cities. But you'll see in just a moment that that was kind of like the Big Ten in college football. It's called the Big Ten, but there's more than 10 teams. When it comes to Decapolis, it was indeed that which originally comprised 10 Greek cities. Watch this point. 9 of those were east of the Jordan. Just one of those cities in the Decapolis was west, and that was Bethshan. And we've talked about Bethshan before. Here's Perea, and you come on up here, and here's Scythopolis, or Bethshan, as it was known in the Old Testament. And so this is the general area right in here. Now, notice, if you will, that Alexander the Great and some of his followers were very instrumental in starting some of these places. Pliny was the first writer to mention the Decapolis, the Decapolis. He lists the original 10 as these: Bethshan, also known as Scythopolis, Pella, Dion, Canatha, Raphana, Hippos, Gadara, Philadelphia, Rabbath Ammon, Damascus, and Jerusha, or Jerash. So there were times, if you want to get right down to it, as many as 18 cities formed this Hellenistic league of nations, you might say, or of cities. And so each city would control the region round about it. But, for example, the ruins of Jerusha, a city that flourished during the 2nd and 3rd centuries A.D., shows us that this was a very high culture for its time. You'll notice that this picture right here is the Decapolis, also known as Scythopolis, and formerly known as Bethshan. It's been excavated and partially restored. And so it's pretty interesting to visit there. I was privileged to do so, and it is interesting. As a matter of fact, let me take a moment and just show you. Notice here it is right here. Here's Bethshan, and let me make this a little bit larger. This is Bethshan's National Park, and this is the timeline showing some of Bethshan's. You'll see it going all the way from the Canaanite period through the Judges, and then the Israelite kingdom, and then notice the Hellenistic kingdom, and it just kept going. I think I mentioned this to you in a previous class. This is actually a vomitorium. You'd come to the theater, drink too much. Some people unfortunately did, and so you need to excuse yourself so you could go in the vomitorium and spew forth your vomit. Not exactly a pleasant thing to consider. The theater at Bethshan, remember, also known as Scythopolis, had about 7,000 seats. It's the best preserved ancient theater in Israel. that's been discovered to this point. It was built actually at the end of the 2nd century on top of a 1st century theater, and so it had quite a bit of history associated with it. This is some of the ruins there at Bethshan. Look how huge, absolutely huge, those columns are. You see my wife standing there, and just think about the weight of the girth of these columns, and that's just absolutely incredible. And then think about the size of this Capitol. This goes on top of one of these columns. Imagine this by itself, the enormous weight to it and the decor. It's really incredible to consider. And let's get back to a little bit of this history, political history of Rome from 40 BC to AD 70. This would be the time of starting out the kingdom of Herod the Great. Remember, we talked about that Idumean governor named Antipater, or Antipas, and he is thought to have come from Ascalon in the country that was once controlled by the Phoenicians. And then during the time of John Hyrcanus, Antipater and his family were forced to adopt the Jewish religion and accept the rites of circumcision. And so you've got Julius Caesar at that time gaining control of the Roman Empire. Meanwhile, a son of Antipater bearing the same name as his father became the virtual ruler of Palestine. And then Caesar's assassinated. Cassius appears as the proconsul of Syria. And Antipater was given the task of raising a large sum of money, about $1.5 million at current values, for Rome. We'll talk more about that in a moment. I want to point out to you that your textbook has a family tree starting with Herod the Great and continuing on down and showing you his wives, plural, some of their offspring. You'll notice Herod Antipas, Herod Philip, Herod Agrippa, Herod II, now let me go back to the textbook. By the way, these columns here are from the harbor that was built by Herod the Great at Caesarea Maritima, and we'll get back to that in just a moment. What's the purpose of this money that would be raised, $1.5 million? It was for Rome to expand its size and beauty. And that does not mean, by the way, that Antipater was greatly loved. In fact, the resentment against him grew so much that he was poisoned by Malichus, a man that posed as a friend while really trying to wrest the government away for himself. And then you've got Antony and Octavian defeating Cassius on the plains of Philippi and Macedonia, not Caesarea Philippi, but another one. And then there's all this history of how Antigonus enlisted the aid of the Parthians. The Parthians were a warlike people that had never been conquered by Rome. Jerusalem was occupied by the Parthians. Phasael was captured and committed suicide. He was one of the sons of Antipater. Herod escapes to Egypt and then to Rome in 40 BC. Now, in Rome, Herod was a son of Antipater, was able to impress Antony and Octavian, so they named him, quote, King of the Jews. But that doesn't mean everything came easy. He had to fight for his kingdom. He found a number of sympathizers when he got back to Judea, but he had to use Roman arms to occupy Jerusalem, and they besieged it for 5 months before it actually fell. Now, Herod attempted to win the favor of the Jews in the following ways. He would publicly observe the law. and he wanted to really magnify the temple and really adorn it to make it top-notch, thinking this would endear him to the people. In fact, Stratos Tower, it's located on the Mediterranean Sea, was actually rebuilt as a port city and named Caesarea in honor of Octavian Augustus. Now, notice this. Samaria was rebuilt, but it's called Sebaste, named after the wife of Augustus. Now, there was a temple in Jerusalem during the time of Christ, but it was not the same as the temple in Jerusalem that was built when they came home from Babylonian captivity. Some parts were the same, but Herod had really adorned the temple project and really tried to bring it along. And so Herod the Great built all kinds of things during this time period. He built a palace, a hilltop stronghold, named it after himself, Herodium. It's a few miles to the east of Bethlehem, and it was capped by an artificial mound, was intended to be a place of safety for a paranoid monarch. This is you can see the depth of this hill. It would take more than a little bit of effort to get from point A to point B. Now, it's important to note that because of his desire to get along with the people and out of his deference to the Mosaic law, Herod placed no statues in the Jerusalem temple because he knew it would be offensive. And he tried to win the favor of the Jews by doing the following things. He publicly observed Jewish law. He rebuilt on a grand scale their temple, the one that had been built by the Jews who came home from Babylonian captivity. But the Jews didn't appreciate his labors because for all the good that he did, the man was so mercilessly cruel. I mean, he had no mercy at all on people, and his cruel behavior just caused them to ignore the kind, magnanimous things that he thought he was doing for them. And besides that, his Idumean blood didn't make him an easy suspect. Now, in later years, Herod, frankly, appears to have been insane. You look at his behavior with his domestic family. Murdered his wife, Mariamne, his favorite wife. He murders her. Murders her grandfather, Hyrcanus, her brother, Aristobulus, and several of his own children. Well, this is the Herod that was on duty when the Christ was born in Bethlehem, and the Bible says that Herod, when he heard the report of the birth of the one who was to be the king of the Jews, ordered the massacre of the infants in Bethlehem and its surrounding environment. Matthew 2:16. History calls Herod the Great, but he wasn't really great. He knew that his death would bring rejoicing among the Jews. He ordered the leaders of the Jews to be executed at the time of his death. And he said, that way there will be plenty of weeping and wailing going on, and people will probably assume it's for me, the king. But that murderous project never did come to full fruition. Let's talk about the tetrarchy, or tetrarchy, depending on your preferred pronunciation and which one your teacher wants you to use. I prefer tetrarch, and so the tetrarch meant the ruler of a fourth part. Archelaus became the tetrarch of Judea and Samaria. He ruled Palestine south of the valley of Esdraelon. And then Herod the tetrarch, or Antipas, he ordered the death of John the Baptizer. This is because he had the jurisdiction over Galilee and Perea. Here's Galilee, here's Perea. And so this Herod that we're talking about had jurisdiction over that. When Herod Antipas rejected his wife, a daughter of a Nabatean king, Aretas, to Mary Herodias, wife of his brother Philip. Well, this infuriated many of the pious Jews, and Herod's reign spanned the time of Jesus' ministry, but then he was finally banished by Caligula in AD 39. Now, I was mentioning a moment ago how Philip succeeded in Romanizing this area, erecting a marble temple in honor of Augustus on the majestic rocks above the older city of Panias, or Banias, also called. He rebuilt it as Caesarea, distinguished it from the coastal city of the same name, and called it Caesarea Philippi instead. Let me show you some pictures of this area. I've shown you these before, but these are even more wide-angle shots than I've shown you. No wonder Jesus said, "Upon this rock I will build my church," while he was in this vicinity, because that's what it essentially is, this solid rock. And you see this temple of Augustus that I mentioned a moment ago, built during the reign of Herod the Great in honor of the Roman Emperor Augustus. Of course, the temple is gone. Why? Because what men can build, men can destroy. And so those Greek temples that were built, that are depicted in this picture, are now gone because they were destroyed by man. One thing to notice here is that Philip was really able to rule peacefully for 37 years and is reputed to have been the very best of the sons of Herod the Great. You'll notice that when Archelaus was deposed in AD 6, Judea and Samaria were annexed, governed by procurators, and at the time of Christ's crucifixion there was a fifth procurator known as Pontius Pilate, and he was in office. These procurators were never able to reconcile their Jewish constituents to Roman rule, and the Jews stayed pretty restive until the time of the revolt that brought on the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Quickly notice the kingdom of Herod Agrippa the First. This is AD 41 to 44. The Roman Emperor Caligula befriended Herod Agrippa and made him the king over the territory east of Galilee. It had been formerly his uncle's territory, but it was now in his hands. Agrippa was given also rule over southern Syria and Palestine, and that included practically all the kingdom his grandfather Herod the Great had owned or ruled over. So Agrippa espouses the Pharisees' cause, and Josephus speaks of his zeal for the Jewish religion. And so what did this Herod Agrippa the First do? He persecuted the church severely, caused James the apostle to be slain, Peter to be imprisoned, and Josephus tells us that Herod Agrippa was seized by severe pains during a celebration at Caesarea, and when he was being recognized as a god, and 5 days later he died. Acts chapter 12 verses 20 to 23 talk about his death. Now these provinces were divided from AD 44 to AD 70. When Herod Agrippa died, his son Herod Agrippa II was only 17, and the Emperor Claudius divided the kingdom. And so then you had the southern section of Judea, Samaria, Galilee, and Perea, and they became the province of Judea, subsequently ruled by those procurators I was mentioning earlier. And you recall that a northern section east of the Jordan was later assigned to Herod Agrippa II, AD 49, and this was the Herod that was the expert in all customs and questions among the Jews, and the one to whom Paul was brought by Festus, Acts 25 and Acts 26. Herod Agrippa II sided with the Romans. He fought alongside of Vespasian, and when Jerusalem fell in AD 70, he went to Rome and stayed there till about AD 100, died there, and held the rank of praetor. Now let's talk briefly about the Nabatean kingdom. I've already alluded to the fact that they pushed the Edomites up out of their land and their territory, and the Nabatean city of Petra, those buildings you may recall cut out of red sandstone, very high in that mountainous district. It was located on a very important trade route. Some of those irrigation projects enabled the Nabateans to maintain settlements in the Negev, which was barren, but because they built huge cisterns and built dams and aqueducts and water channels, and the hills were terraced to keep the earth from being swept away, they were able to conserve every drop of water and make an otherwise barren territory a place fit to live. The Nabatean area would include what used to be Edom, and the Nabatean era came to an end in AD 105 when the Roman Emperor Trajan occupied their land and made it a Roman province of Arabia Petraea. That's all we'll have time for. The next video that we do will be on the life of Christ, and this is something I'm very excited to study about. Thank you very much.